All right, today we're tackling one of the most fascinating puzzles in modern philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche's really intense, deeply personal, and frankly paradoxical struggle with the figure of Jesus Christ.
Just let this sink in for a second. In reality, there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. I mean, that is an incredible statement. It's his expression of almost pure admiration, right? It suggests this one-of-a-kind, totally authentic person whose message was so unique, maybe it could never be repeated.
So, who do you think said that? The answer is almost certainly not who you're thinking. It was Friedrich Nietzsche. Yep, the very same philosopher who's famous for his absolutely blistering attacks on Christianity.
And that, right there, is the central mystery we're going to unpack. How could the guy who wrote the Antichrist seem to hold the ultimate reverence for Christ himself? It feels like a total contradiction. So let's dive in and try to make sense of it.
You know, to really get Nietzsche's intellectual war with Christianity, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to his childhood, which was just completely steeped in faith.
So get this, he was born into this long line of Lutheran pastors, and as a kid, Friedrich was so incredibly devout that his friends actually nicknamed him the Little Pastor. Apparently, he could recite Bible verses with so much feeling, so much emotion, that he would move people to tears. This wasn't just some casual belief system for him, it was deep in his bones.
But then his formal education started to systematically tear that all down. First at an elite boarding school and then at university, he shifted his focus from theology to classical philology. And that's where he started applying these really rigorous historical and critical methods to the very texts he once held sacred. From that point on, his path away from orthodox belief was pretty much set in stone.
So this whole intellectual journey leads him to this really radical conclusion. He decides that to find the truth, he has to perform a kind of surgery. He has to separate the man, Jesus, from the entire religion of Christianity that was built around his name.
Now, Nietzsche just completely tosses out the popular 19th century ideas of Jesus as some kind of hero or genius. No. Instead, he offers a psychological, almost physiological diagnosis. He argues that Jesus was what he called a neurasthenic type. Basically, a person with such an extreme, almost pathological sensitivity that any kind of conflict or confrontation with the real world caused him just unbearable pain.
And this is the key, right? This diagnosis changes everything about Jesus' message. Suddenly, turn the other cheek isn't some grand moral law, it's a survival instinct. It's a physiological coping mechanism. And his talk about the kingdom of heaven? For Nietzsche, that wasn't about some future paradise. It was about achieving an inner state of peace, a condition of the heart, right here and now. It was a necessary retreat from a world that was just too harsh for him to handle. Nietzsche actually sharpens this idea after he discovers the work of Dostoevsky, who he called the only psychologist he ever learned anything from. He starts to see Jesus as an idiot in that classic Dostoevskian sense. You know, a kind of holy fool. A person whose radical innocence and purity makes him completely unable to function in the real world. He was noble for sure, but fundamentally anti-realist.
Okay, so if Jesus was the only true Christian, who does Nietzsche think is responsible for creating the actual religion of Christianity? Who's the villain in this story?
Well, his answer couldn't be clearer. He points the finger squarely at one man, the Apostle Paul. If Jesus brought the evangel, the good news, Nietzsche brilliantly labels Paul the disevangel, the bearer of bad news. For him, Paul was the twisted genius who orchestrated the entire betrayal. And the fundamental difference between them, according to Nietzsche, all came down to motivation. Jesus' entire way of life was aimed at finding this inner peace, this bliss, and it was completely free from hate or revenge. But Paul was driven by what Nietzsche famously called a resentment. That's this simmering, powerless rage that the weak feel toward the strong, a rage that seeks its revenge in an imaginary world. And this table here really breaks down how Paul allegedly corrupted the original message. For Jesus, faith was a practice, something you did. Paul turned it into a belief, a system of dogma you had to accept. Jesus' kingdom of heaven was inside you. Paul moved it to some transcendent afterlife. Nietzsche argues that Paul basically invented sin, guilt, and the idea of redemption through a future sacrifice, all concepts he believed were totally foreign to Jesus' original message of inner bliss.
Now, this lifelong philosophical war wasn't just some abstract academic game for him. It created this absolutely devastating psychological pressure inside of Nietzsche that would eventually define the very end of his sane life.
In his final works, he boils this entire conflict down to one epic showdown. On one side, you have Dionysus, the Greek god of ecstasy, who represents a powerful, roaring yes to life, a worldview where even suffering is embraced as part of life's richness. And on the other side, you have the crucified, who represents a no to life, a total rejection of this world in favor of some other holy existence. And this internal war finally reached its tragic breaking point in Turin, Italy. He saw a man brutally whipping a horse in the street, and Nietzsche, in a flood of emotion, ran over, threw his arms around the horse's neck to protect it, and then collapsed. It was this overwhelming act of the very Christian pity that he had spent his entire life's work trying to overcome. He never recovered his sanity after that.
In the days immediately after his collapse, he wrote these bizarre, frantic letters, which we now call the Madness Letters. And in them, his entire philosophical identity just shatters into a million pieces. In one, he signs off with the chilling words, "the crucified."
In these letters, he completely merges with the very figures he'd spent his life thinking about. He talks about having taken possession of my empire and that he's had Caiaphas put in chains. His own suffering and the suffering of Christ become one and the same in his broken mind.
And this is where we see the final, tragic synthesis. In his madness, the great opposition he built his philosophy on just collapses. The two enemies become one. He signs his letters, sometimes as Dionysus, other times as the crucified. The war inside him was finally over.
So where does that leave us? It leaves us with this huge, unavoidable question. Does Nietzsche's deep admiration for Jesus the man actually make his critique of Christianity more powerful, more devastating? Or does his own tragic collapse, where he seems to become the very thing he fought against, somehow undermine his entire life's work? That's the paradox of the Nazarene.